me not see it.
I was cleaning out the attic when I found the Polaroids. They were tucked inside an old, dust-caked shoebox behind the chimney flue. There were dozens of them, all showing the same thing, a room that looked like a bleached-out void. Just a single wooden chair placed perfectly in the center, and a door on the far wall. The perspective was always the same, as if the photographer had been sitting exactly where I was standing. Except, I had never been to that house before. I had never even heard of the previous owners. But as I flipped through the stack, the familiarity clawed at my throat. I knew the exact knot in the wood of that chair. I knew that if I looked at the door handle, I would notice a small, jagged scratch on the brass, like someone had tried to pry it open with a pocket knife. That night, the transition wasn't a fade to black. It was like being pulled under a frozen lake. I blinked, and the bedroom, my soft mattress, the hum of the city outside, was gone. The silence was absolute. It wasn't just quiet, it was an absence of existence. I was sitting in the chair. The white walls didn't reflect light, they swallowed it. There was no floor seam, no ceiling corner, just an infinite expanse of sterile, blinding nothingness. I looked at the door. It was closed, polished, and indifferent. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird, but the panic felt distant, muffled by the sheer pressure of the space around me. I stood up. My joints popped, a sound that seemed too loud, too biological for such a vacuum. Every step I took toward the door felt like pushing through invisible syrup. The air wasn't thin, it felt thick and stagnant, tasting like old iron and wet dust. I reached for the handle. The metal was biting cold. When I turned it, there was no click of a latch, just a sickening slide of friction. I pulled the door open, expecting another room or a hallway, but there was only a void behind it. I stepped forward, and the sensation was instantaneous. My consciousness didn't just end, it collapsed. It was a total, sudden erasing of thought. Then, I was back in the chair. I don't know how long I sat there. The concept of time didn't exist, yet I felt myself eroding. I started to notice things I hadn't seen before. The floor under the chair was stained. Not with dirt, but with something dark and crusty. It looked like a map of dried blood, mapped out in long, desperate smears. I leaned down, my face inches from the floor, and saw the indentations. They were fingernail marks. Someone had been scratching at the floor, trying to dig their way out, or maybe they had been dragged. The smell hit me then, not copper, but the sickly sweet, cloying odor of rotting meat left in a sealed plastic bag. It was the smell of something that had been trying to survive until it simply couldn't anymore. I stood up, my legs shaking, and looked at the door again. This time, I noticed something carved into the frame. It was a tally. Hundreds of them. Deep, jagged gashes in the wood. They weren't just scratches, they were records. I reached out, my fingers tracing the marks, and I realized they weren't random. They were rhythmic, spaced out like the beating of a pulse. My pulse. The horror wasn't the room. It was the realization that I wasn't the first version of me to sit in that chair. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, but they didn't look like mine. They looked thin, translucent, like parchment pulled too tight over bone. I pushed the door open again, desperate to end it, to find the exit, to find the life I had left behind. I didn't care if it killed me this time. I threw myself into the doorway. The cessation was even more violent. It felt like my brain was being crushed by a closing vice. I woke up in my bed. The alarm was blaring, a harsh, mechanical scream that made me jump. My skin was cold, covered in a thin layer of sweat that felt like slime. I crawled out of bed, my mind racing, trying to convince myself it was just a fever dream. I walked to the bathroom, needing to splash cold water on my face to shake the phantom smell of rot. I turned on the faucet, and for a second, the water looked dark, thick, and murky. I rubbed my eyes, and it cleared up. I went to the kitchen to pour a coffee, my hands still unsteady. I reached for a mug, but my eyes caught something on the floor near the kitchen island. A small, dark smear. I knelt down, my heart stalling in my chest. It was a tiny, dried patch of what looked like old blood. I looked closer, and there, on the linoleum, were faint, white, scratch marks. The exact pattern from the floor in the room. I backed away, stumbling into the hallway. I looked at the wall near the front door. There, hidden behind a decorative mirror, were hundreds of tiny, parallel gashes in the drywall. I grabbed the mirror and ripped it off the wall. The markings weren't just there, they were carved into the studs, into the very structure of the house. I realized then that the dream wasn't a loop I was visiting. The loop was bleeding into my reality. I grabbed my keys, shaking, needing to get out, to run until I found a place where the walls weren't white, where the silence didn't carry the weight of 1,000 deaths. I made it to the front door, my hand on the knob, but I stopped. I looked at the brass handle. There, right in the center, was a small, jagged scratch. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't the person who had gone to sleep in this bed. The person who had gone to sleep here was already in the room. I was the leftover. I was the memory fragment that had been pushed out, the one that keeps forgetting it's already dead. I looked at my reflection in the mirror I had dropped. My face was there, but my eyes, they were hollow, devoid of the spark that makes someone real. I tried to turn the knob, but the metal began to feel soft, warping under my touch like warm wax. The walls of my hallway started to blur, the paint peeling away to reveal the sterile, blinding white underneath. The smell of rot filled the house, thick and suffocating. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was already filled with the white nothingness. I am back in the chair. The door is in front of me. I know what is behind it. I know that if I open it, I will be back in my kitchen, in my house, for a few more minutes of borrowed existence. I will see the scratches on the wall. I will feel the rot in the air. And then I will be back here. I have lived 1,000 lifetimes in this room, and I am starting to think that I am not waiting for the dream to end. I am waiting for the room to finish consuming me. I am tired, and the chair is so cold, but I know I have to get up. I have to open the door again. Because the only thing worse than being trapped here is the fear of what happens when the door finally stops opening, and there's nothing left of me to wake up in the void.
Next story.
I woke up on the floor. Not in bed, not in the guest room, but sprawled out on the cold, unfinished concrete of the basement floor. The air down there usually feels stagnant, thick with the scent of damp earth and mold, but that morning, the smell was different. It was sharp, thick, and visceral, like raw, what meat left out in the summer heat, sweet and sickly, coating the back of my throat. My head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic pulse, matching the faint, flickering hum of the overhead fluorescent light that hadn't worked in months. I didn't remember going down there. I didn't remember walking down those creaky wooden stairs. I just stood up, my knees popping, and brushed the grit off my jeans. The first thing I noticed was my reflection in the old vanity mirror propped against the furnace. My face was pale, almost gray, and there was a streak of something dark and viscous drying on my neck. I wiped it away with my thumb. It was sticky, dark brown, and smeared across my skin like oil. I headed upstairs, my feet feeling strangely disconnected from my brain. When I pushed open the door to the kitchen, the house felt wrong. It was the same layout, the same chipped paint on the doorframe, the same stack of mail on the counter, but the lighting was off. Everything seemed to have a faint, sickly yellow tint, as if the sun had decided to stop providing clean light. I called for my dog, Buster. He was curled up in his bed by the fridge. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't even lift his head. When I got closer, he let out a low, pathetic whimper and tucked his nose under his paw, refusing to look at me. It was like I was a stranger wearing a skin he didn't recognize. I made coffee, hoping to shake off the grogginess, but the liquid was thin and tasted like hot water and dust. I sat down at the table, staring at the mail. There was a letter from a debt collector, a reminder about a bill I had already paid, and a postcard from an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years. Except the handwriting on the postcard wasn't hers. It was shaky, jagged, and scratched into the card so deeply it had torn the paper. It just said, "You are still in the audit." I dropped the card. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I remembered the dream then, or whatever it was. It wasn't a nightmare, it was a cold, surgical extraction of my conscience. I had fallen. I remembered the sensation of plummeting, the wind rushing past my ears until the world shattered into gray static. And then, the void. It wasn't black, it was a colorless, infinite space where I was forced to observe every selfish, cruel, and reckless thing I had ever done. But I didn't just watch. I felt. When I stole money from my brother's wallet when I was 10, I felt his confusion and the sting of his betrayal as if it were my own. When I ghosted that girl in college, I felt the exact moment her hope turned into hollow resentment. It went on for what felt like centuries. It was a clinical, emotionless breakdown of my own existence. I stood up and walked to the living room, needing to see something normal. I turned on the television. The screen hissed with white noise, a chaotic, shifting wall of static that made my eyes ache. Then, the image cleared. It was me. A video of me, sitting in that exact chair, staring at the screen. I was sleeping in the video. I looked at the couch. It was empty. But on the screen, I was there, unconscious, with my mouth slightly open. I reached out to touch the screen, and my hand passed through the glass like it was thick, viscous syrup. I pulled back, gasping, and tripped over the rug. My leg hit the coffee table, and I heard a sickening, wet snap. I looked down, expecting to see a bone poking through the skin, or at least a bruise. There was nothing. No break, no blood, no pain. Just the sound of the snap echoing in the quiet room. I reached down to feel my shin, and my hand went right through my own flesh, as if I were made of nothing more than rendered static and thin light. I wasn't solid anymore. I was a copy, a low-resolution rendering of a person who had died in a basement somewhere, and the world was trying to maintain the illusion of my existence. I ran to the front door, clawing at the lock. The metal felt like freezing slush under my fingers. I shoved the door open, desperate for fresh air, for the sight of the street, for anything real. But there was no street. There was just a hallway, infinite and stretching out into a dull, flat horizon. No sky, no ground, just a repetition of my house, door after door, stretching into a hazy, unending distance. I looked back inside. My dog was standing up now. He wasn't Buster. It was a jagged, pulsating mess of fur and teeth, shifting in and out of focus. It looked at me with eyes that were just hollow, spinning voids. It opened its mouth, and instead of a bark, a sound came out, a recording of my own voice, distorted and slowed down, whispering all the names of the people I had hurt during that audit. I realized then that I wasn't being punished for the things I had done. I was being recycled. The void didn't care about my morality, it was just mining my history to build this hollow, decaying replica of a life. I tried to scream, but the air in my lungs was just static. I felt my skin start to peel away, not in sheets of flesh, but in blocks of flickering, low-quality pixels. I fell to my knees, or what used to be my knees, as the hallway began to collapse toward me, a crush of soundless, gray geometry. I looked at my hand one last time before it dissolved into the background. I could see through the wall behind it, and there, on the basement floor, I saw myself. A limp, broken heap of meat, with a puddle of dark, wet fluid pooling beneath my skull. The audit was over. The mistake had been corrected. And as the static consumed my vision, the last thing I felt was the relief of finally, truly ending. But the loop didn't stop. It just reset, and I woke up on the cold, concrete floor of the basement again.
Next story.
It started as a typical, mundane Tuesday night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling that familiar, sluggish weight in my chest that comes with exhaustion. My apartment was quiet, too quiet. I had this persistent, irrational fear of dying in my sleep, a thought that always crept in right before I drifted off. I decided to try a guided meditation I found online to stop the spiral. I closed my eyes, focused on my breathing, and imagined myself walking through a beautiful, open meadow. It was vivid, the grass felt real under my feet, the air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. I reached a ledge in the dream, a high cliff overlooking a vast, endless sea. In my dream state, I felt a strange, detached urge to see what would happen if I just stepped off. I didn't think it was real. I thought my brain would just snap me awake the moment I hit the water, like it always does. I knowingly walked off the edge. I waited for the jolt of adrenaline, the gasping wake up, the cold sweat on my sheets. It never came. I just kept falling. At first, there was wind. Then, the sensation of falling just stopped. Not that I hit anything, but the feeling of motion vanished. I was suspended in a thick, gray mist that tasted like wet limestone and old dust. It wasn't dark, just dim, like an overcast afternoon that never transitions into evening. I tried to scream, but the air was so dense it felt like trying to swallow sludge. My voice didn't even leave my throat. I floated there for what felt like hours, or maybe even years. Time lost all meaning in that gray expanse. I wasn't cold, and I wasn't hungry, but I was gripped by a level of panic that felt like it was tearing my soul apart. Eventually, I realized I wasn't alone. Other people were drifting through the fog, spaced out like buoys in a calm ocean. They all had the same hollow, glazed-over expressions, their eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I managed to move, swimming through the thick air toward one of them. It was a man, looking middle-aged, wearing clothes that looked like they were from a different decade. I reached out and grabbed his arm. It felt like cold, wet wax. He didn't jump. He didn't even look at me. He just slowly turned his head, his skin looking pale and translucent, and whispered with a voice that sounded like grinding teeth, "Don't wake up, they'll notice you're missing." Fear, cold and sharp, shot through me. I let go of him and started drifting in the opposite direction, my heart hammering against my ribs. I hid behind a dense bank of mist, curled up in a ball, trying to make myself as small as possible. I was terrified that if I found my way back to my body, something that wasn't me would have already moved in to take my place. I was a stowaway in a dimension of lost souls, and I knew deep down that they were watching. I don't know how long I stayed there. I tried to force myself awake, pinching my own arm until I felt the phantom sensation of pain, but nothing happened. I was stuck. Then, the mist began to shift. It wasn't moving with the wind, it was being parted. Something was coming. I couldn't see it clearly, just a distortion in the air, a ripple in the fabric of the gray void. It moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, like a film frame skipping. I held my breath, terrified that the slightest movement would give me away. I watched as the entity drifted toward the man I had spoken to earlier. It didn't have hands, but it touched his forehead with a limb that looked like a long, calcified branch. The man didn't scream. He just vanished, folding into himself until he was nothing more than a speck of light that extinguished instantly. I realized then that this place was a collection bin, a purgatory for people who had slipped through the cracks of reality. My skin crawled as I realized the entity was turning, its invisible gaze searching the mist. It was looking for me. It knew I was awake. It knew I wasn't supposed to be part of the collection. I started to run, pushing through the thick, viscous air. My lungs felt like they were filled with sand. Every time I looked back, the distortion was closer. The environment began to change. The soft gray mist started to harden into sharp, jagged edges of charcoal-colored rock. I realized I was being funneled. There was no way out, only further in. I saw my body. It was lying there, suspended in a translucent membrane, like a specimen in a jar. It looked so peaceful, so unaware of the nightmare I was living. I reached out to touch it, to try and pull myself back into my own skin, but a hand, or something that looked like a hand, long, pale, and covered in thick, dark veins, slammed against the membrane from the inside. My own body was pushing me away. My own body didn't want me back. I scrambled backward, slipping on the slick, black surface of the floor. My fingers tore against the rock, and I looked down to see that my nails had been ripped away, leaving bloody, raw tissue exposed. The smell was overpowering, a thick, metallic stench of fresh, warm iron and something putrid, like rotting meat left in a hot car. It wasn't the copper smell of a simple nosebleed, it was the sharp, nauseating scent of an open, infected wound. The entity was right behind me now. I could feel its presence, a suction that pulled at my thoughts, trying to smooth them out, to turn me into one of the hollow, glazed-eyed things drifting in the mist. I scrambled to my feet, desperate. I realized there was only one way to wake up. I had to stop fighting the fall. I had to let myself go completely. I turned around, faced the void, and let go of the last shred of my control. I stopped running, stopped breathing, and simply surrendered to the nothingness. The sensation of falling returned, faster and faster, until the wind was a roar in my ears. I slammed into my own body with the force of a wrecking ball. I woke up in my bed, screaming. My sheets were soaked with sweat, and my chest felt like it had been crushed. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, shaking uncontrollably, listening to the silence of my apartment. I eventually managed to stand up and walk to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. When I looked in the mirror, I froze. My reflection was there, but my eyes, they were slightly glazed. And when I blinked, it wasn't quite synchronized. I stared at the mirror, waiting for my reflection to catch up, and for a split second, it didn't. It just stood there, looking at me with a hollow, empty expression that wasn't mine. I'm still here, in my apartment. I go to work, I talk to my friends, I eat. But every time I look in a mirror, I have to make sure I'm the one moving first. I have to make sure that I'm still the one in control. Sometimes, when the room is quiet, I can still taste that wet limestone in the back of my throat. I know I didn't leave everything back there. I think when I stepped off that cliff, something else might have come back with me. And now, I'm just waiting for the day it decides it's time for me to go back to the mist for good.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.